Good evening. Welcome once again to the Bible Speaks Today from LBC Television Ministries. I'm Tony Baxter, but then if you were paying attention to the credits, you would have known that. And I point that way because that's where my monitor is. You'd think they put it in front of me so I could see it, wouldn't you? Never mind. Okay, we've been talking for weeks and weeks and weeks about who wrote the writers of the Bible, who wrote the Bible, who put it together. We've been doing it in a lot of detail, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I ran into a couple over the weekend who mentioned that they watched the program regularly and were really enjoying this latest thing, and I hope you are too. From my point of view, two people who say they like it is better than nobody, and also gives me a great deal of encouragement, because for every person that says they like it, there's probably a few more out there who don't live close to me or don't know me or don't, ever run into contact with me to be able to say anything. But your emails are welcome if you want to send one. Okay, I'm not touting for congratulations. Just sometimes it's nice to know that somebody's watching, even if it's a critical email, and I do get some of those from time to time. It seems to me that it's about a 10-to-1 ratio. If I mess up and say something I shouldn't have done, or if I say something controversial that I know people aren't going to like, I can guarantee on a few emails saying, we're going to come and get you or something. But I don't get too many that say, hey, I like that, that was good. So feel free to vent if you wish to. I will apologize for one mistake I made last week. One of the things about the camera crew is that, of course, they're here in the studio with me. They're the people who switch the cameras and do all this. And I said I was talking about the North and the South of America during the Civil War, and I inadvertently said North America and South America because we didn't have a civil war with South America, and I was brought to heel on that one. Sometimes there's so many things going through your mind, you get it wrong. I'm sure you know what I mean. But so those of you who are about to put pen to paper, well, it's a week ago for you, so you're probably going to send it to me anyway. Never mind. We finished up last week with discussing in a little bit of detail the return of the captives from Babylon to Judah and the motivations. And we talked a lot about numbers, and I don't want to get too carried away with numbers. But something you need to consider when you read, in the Bible stories like, okay, we left Babylon and we went to Judah. Well, Babylon's a long way from Israel by road or by foot or by camel. All right, it probably wouldn't have been by boat, and it certainly wouldn't be by airplane, obviously. So you're looking at, even if Ezra is correct when he says 42,360 returned 50 years later, they probably didn't all come at once. I doubt if any country between Babylon and, you know where Babylon is, in Iraq? Yes? Okay. So look at the map. Iraq, Babylon, Israel. They're going to come all the way around there. Any country on the way could have supported 42,000 people all marching together with all their worldly goods and belongings and that sort of thing. Plus the fact, let's not forget that when they got taken to Babylon, they wouldn't have been taking their goats and their sheep and their cows and their livestock with them, just people. And Babylon is a city, not a rural community. And whilst I agree that a lot of the exiles would have probably set up farms and small holdings, and in 50 years they probably did have some cattle and that sort of thing, it wouldn't have been anything like the amount that they had when they were in Israel. So not just myself, but a lot of scholars, more clever than I, have kind of worked out that it was in phases, in waves. People went, there probably was an advance guard of young people who went ahead to sort of scout the way out. Because we're talking about women and children, grandpa and grandma and everything else. You're not going to travel 20 miles a day or 15 miles a day, even 5 miles a day sometimes. It's going to take them a long time. And then when you get to Judah, what are you going to do? The temple's in ruins. I'm sure Jerusalem was inhabited, at least by the remnants of people left behind. But in 50 years, I doubt much building had gone on. And if it did, it probably wasn't big stuff. So where are you going to put all these people? And what about people who left their land behind and came back and found somebody else living in it, which is very likely and most probable? I mean, excuse me, you're on my farm. Well, my people have been here 50 years. What are you talking about? Now, maybe they worked it out. I don't know. The Bible's very, very, it's very scant information on that. I know that even if you've stayed behind, people got carried off, you moved into their farm because it was empty, or maybe you didn't. You moved into their house in the city because it was empty, carried on a business, and then 50 years later, some guy comes banging on your door and says, hey, this is mine. Give it to me back. And if you want an illustration of that, closer to home, let's look at the history of over the Second World War. And in this country, in America, when anyone of Japanese descent, be they citizens or not, were put in camps for the whole war, and their businesses and belongings and everything were taken over by other people. Did they get them back at the end of the war? Not a bit of it. Maybe not one of the best examples of human treatment in America, but they didn't. And that's only after 4 or 5 years. So after 50 years, imagine people coming back weren't expecting or didn't likely get what they thought they were going to get. It was a tough time, really bad. And so I think they came in waves. Anyway, they came back and they rebuilt, between 537 and 530, they rebuilt Jerusalem bit by bit. I'm sure it was pretty low level housing, and they dedicated, according to the Bible, in 516 BC, they dedicated the Second Temple. We've no idea of the size, it's not mentioned, but you can rest assured it was not as grand as the previous temple had been, the first temple. Simply probably wasn't the money, wasn't the people there to... I mean, Solomon spent a lot of money on the first temple, brought in a lot of expatriate labour, imported a lot of timber, had money to pay for things. I'm sure the second temple was quite rudimentary, if anything. It had no ark, no tabernacle, no cherubs, no Urim and Thummim, the things they used to sort of cast lots with for making divinations, which is always a bit of a problem for me. I can't see what that has to do with God when you start throwing some sort of dice to make a decision, but they did. But it was gone, not there, okay? What it did have was an Aaronoid, or a high priest from the party of Aaron, supporting Aaron. Now, you might think, well, what's that got to do with anything? Well, let me tell you that had a huge impact on the future development of the Bible. I mean, you say, why an Aaron high priest and not a Moses high priest? Well, there's actually a reason for that. The Mushites, which is the priests or the tribe from Moses, or the priests who supported Moses, were called Mushites, were perceived as being pro-Babylon, as opposed to pro-Turk or pro-Persian or pro-Egyptian. Whereas the Aaronite group, Aaron's group, were perceived as being anti-Babylon. Cyrus has just conquered Babylon. He's not probably very keen on putting somebody in charge who's got sort of a leaning towards Babylon. And so the Aaron group became the high priest, okay? Another reason, too, we might consider why that happened is the power and the influence of Ezra. Ezra was a very influential person within the Jewish community, and therefore probably had contacts within the palace. And this is much later on. Ezra's quite powerful back in Babylon. He's not with the first group of people. Everyone thinks that they all came back and Ezra and Nehemiah came with them. No, they didn't. Not a bit of it. Not as a sideline, but let's consider something for a minute. There are 2 lawgivers in the Bible. The Bible mentions 2 lawgivers. One is Moses, and the other is Ezra. Nobody else is mentioned as to giving laws or stating laws or anything else. Ezra is almost on the same level as Moses. Now Ezra didn't come to Jerusalem until 458, some 80 years after the initial people came. So obviously Ezra was back in Babylon, sorting things, which is, and again, gives rise to the idea that the people came in waves. When they got enough houses built, some more came. When they built some more, and there's all sorts of problems going on with the people around them, which we're not going to get into in this program, in this series anyway. Maybe sometime later in another program. But Ezra didn't come until 80 years. So the Israelites had been back in Israel, in Judah, for 80 years before Ezra turns up. All right? So what was Ezra? Ezra was an Aaronid priest. Also, he was a skilled scribe, as so many priests were. He also came carrying the Torah of Moses. Now, the Torah of Moses, what was that? It's important, that comment there. What was the Torah of Moses? What was it? Well, there's references to it in Ezra and Nehemiah and this sort of thing, but it included material from J and E, D, so J and E, Judah, Israel, Deuteronomy, and P, and that's what we're going to be talking about for the next couple of weeks. P, the priestly input, right? And what the Torah of Moses was the first 5 books that we know today, as we know them today. He also had authority from Artaxerxes, who was the ruler at the time, so obviously Cyrus has moved on, and he is now, with Nehemiah, more of him later, but he is now running the place. He's the high priest, Nehemiah is the governor. They're still a vassal country under Persia. It's still they're not free. But let's look at what's happened. The second temple has been built. Centralization has been achieved. In other words, if you want to get anything done, sacrifice something, you've got to go to the temple, which is the Aaron group's way of thinking, which is in Deuteronomy's way of thinking, okay? Ezra, if you read the book, Ezra calls a meeting of all the people, celebration, and then reads the Torah to them. Now, if you read the Bible carefully, you'll see that the remark was made, I forget the exact wording, but it says, it was as if they had not heard it before. And I believe, as do many scholars, that is basically what happened. When he read this Torah out, it had all these 4 different sources put together, and they hadn't heard it like that before. Deuteronomy had been revised to cover the exile, and Deuteronomy, the revision part, was written in Egypt by Jeremiah. And now we have all this, what we're calling P, the priestly source, into it. So the people renewed their commitment. Hey, this is it. This is what we're going to do. We're going to do it this way. Really got serious about it. So how did Ezra have a copy? I mean, was it produced in Babylon, as I suggested last week? Did they sit down and start to write what was going to happen, put it all together? Was it something from before the captivity they carried in with them? Very possible. What it was a combination of all those sources, all 4 sources. Now we know when J and E were put together, obviously before the captivity, at the time of when Israel was conquered and went into captivity. We know when Deuteronomy was put together, at the time or just after the exile of Judah. So what's P? Where did that come from? And when we know who combined everything, into the book as we know them today, then we'll have our answer as to who wrote it. You know, because of references to things past, talking about things happening, you know, in the past, we can't look for the writer of P and the majority of the first 5 books in the days of the Second Temple. It was not written in those years after 516, after the temple. Now, before Ezra got there, it was not written then. It had to have been written, you know, before then. So where do we look? Where do we look? And because of the references to the Ark and the tablets, you know, the 10 Commandments and the Urim and the Thummim, it had to be written before the Second Temple, because those things didn't exist then. They weren't there. Whoever wrote P talks a lot about the tabernacle. Remember I said last week the tabernacle was the enclosure where the ark was kept, and in the first temple was the 2 cherubs with their wings overlapping formed a kind of tent arrangement which was considered to be the tabernacle. Okay, and he places the tabernacle in the center of all the comments and things that he makes, the person who wrote P, back as far as Moses. Now, quick discussion here, very quick. There's a lot of discussion about what the ark was, what the tabernacle was, and what the temple. And there are some scholars who for a long time thought that when the writer of P was talking about the tabernacle, it was a euphemism for the temple. And in recent history, in the last few 20, 30 years, that's been kind of fallen out of favor, because the tabernacle was in the first temple. Now the ark is kind of a, you know, even some people say the ark didn't exist, it was just a tabernacle. But, you know, for the sake of argument, we'll say the ark was there. The ark disappears. We don't know where the ark goes. And then before the Second Temple, before the return to Babylon, the tabernacle disappears too. Don't forget, they didn't bring anything back with them like that. They just brought back the implements and, you know, like the lower valuable stuff. You'd think if they were going to bring something back with them, they'd ask for their cherubs back or something, wouldn't you? And I suppose in those days, when you captured an enemy and you took all his religious or his you know, icons of worship, you kept them stored away. You didn't melt them down and make something else. You kept them so as to demonstrate you could, I suppose. It's something we don't know. We literally don't know. But whoever this chap was, he was the author of the first 5 books. So who was he? Well, most likely he was an Aaronid priest from Judah and in Jerusalem at the time. This is before the exile. And stay with me, we're jumping around a bit. Okay? He had to be familiar, because of what's written in there, he had to be familiar with the Jewish temple practices. He had to have access to the documents and scrolls that were kept there. Remember, a lot of this stuff was not written all together like we see it today. It was in different documents, different scrolls, different stories. When Jeremiah put Kings together, he had access to different things to put them all together in a logical process. This character, this individual, also had to know the J and E texts very well. So if you read P, and I'm told, I've tried it, and it's not too hard to do. Once you're shown what P says in the Bible, it is fairly easy to read it and pick out the verses or the bits that are P. There is that book I was telling you about, which actually does that for you. And I believe there's some, I looked on the internet the other day, and there's some very good dissertations on there on how to recognize P. But P follows J and E in basically the same order. Now remember, Deuteronomy is almost like a standalone. It's a potted history of the Israelites plus the Mosaic Law. So don't get too confused. But the P is more of a set of parallel accounts. Same story, in other words, running parallel. So, a Jerusalem priest at the time of the northern half of the country's conquest, all right? In authority, some form of authority, with special privileges, excuse me, and temple access, but more importantly, a descendant from Aaron. You know, remember the priests in Judah took their descendancy straight from Aaron. Still Levites, as was Moses. So now comes the refugees from the north. And we talked about this a few weeks ago. Same religion, same God, same traditions. Except they've got a rival priesthood, the descendants of Moses, the Mushites. They bring with them, and we've talked about, I'm just going over this again for you. They bring with them the E version of the stories, which conflicts with J. And as we've seen, those two are combined to give a running account, if you will, and we see the conflicts there with the two stories being told the same way, but with different attitudes, okay? But what does it say? Well, let's take one thing, for example. Now, as I said, excuse me one moment. This is an Aaronid priest, descendant of Aaron. So Aaron's the boy as far as he's concerned, not Moses. Okay, what does it say? What does E say? Well, he says that Aaron made a golden calf. Remember? It's all in there. Try and think of these as four separate stories. The Bible split into four, with each one telling a different story, okay? Or the same story, but a different way is what I should say. I'm sorry. All right? And there's a lot of other damning comments about Aaron. How Aaron, made mistakes, did this, did that, If you look in J and E's version, there's very little of Aaron in there. It's all Moses. Moses did this, Moses did that. Aaron's hardly ever mentioned. It doesn't emphasize sacrifice. Now, think about this. You're an Aaronid priest in the temple. In comes these refugees with this E document, and it doesn't emphasize sacrifice, which was the priest's livelihood. Remember how they lived? They had no land, no belongings, no tribal area. They worshipped and worked at the temple and lived off the offerings that were brought to the temple. In other words, your grain and your fruit and your meat offerings were brought. A portion was set aside for the priests. That's way back in the beginning of the whole thing. So in come these people from the north who don't believe that. They don't think that's the way it should be. They don't even believe that it's the sole job of the priests to do sacrifice. Anyone can do it as long as they say the right words and this sort of thing. The key person in E, and J and E now, because it's being combined, is a prophet, not a priest. So what do? Well, if you're an intelligent, in charge, you realize you've got to do something to protect Aaron's reputation. So what you do is write your own account. And P was written as an alternative to J and E. Now we know, because we talked about it, because you have the Bible in front of you on your desk there, right? But we know that they were all combined together. But at this point in time, it's written as an alternative. In J and E, the Lord talks unto Moses, and only unto Moses. Okay? In P, the Lord talks to Moses and Aaron. It's always there. If you go back and look, you'll see the Lord spoke, and then you'll see the same sentence a few verses later where it's the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron. In P, Moses uses Aaron's staff to do the old, plagues and that sort of thing. So Aaron's kind of involved, all right? In J and E, and I stay with me on this, I know it's difficult. Moses and Aaron are called Levite brothers. In other words, they're not necessarily brothers, they are from the same tribe, brothers in a tribe. P states very specifically that Aaron is Moses' brother, flesh relationship. If you look at the genealogy in P, and it's in there if you look for it, it's Aaron's, not Moses. It goes on. In the flood story in Genesis, there's no angels, no talking animals, much less of that sort of thing, because the priests didn't believe in that. The Aaron priests didn't believe in talking angels and talking animals. Not there. The serpent in the garden isn't even mentioned. J starts with earth and heaven. In the beginning there was the earth and there was heaven. P starts with the heaven, with God, heaven and earth. There's a beautiful one in Numbers, the rebellion story in Numbers 16, and if you read that, if you can pick out the J and E version, it's the justification of Moses, and in the P version, it's the justification of Aaron. So you see, the book has been written to show that Aaron is as important as Moses. You can't do away with Moses, too much in tradition, but Aaron is as important. And on that note, I'm going to leave you, okay? And we'll get back with it next week. You might want to read up Genesis again and see what you can pick out the priest stories, because it's really quite interesting. Till then, good night and God bless.